Hey guys, it's been a long time since I've done a video, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to make another production. Um, Today, what I'd like to talk about is narcissism and the way that it impacts your memory. So, I'm fairly certain that a significant number of you might be familiar with this as like a concept or the way that it impacts your life, but it's something that I wasn't really fully cognizant of until much later in life in terms of the way that it enables you to make sense. So I guess I'm just gonna like attack this in broad strokes. So for me, what happened to me was I'm 40 years old now, but when I was 20 years old, I had a kind of nervous breakdown. I mean, I don't know that I would identify it as such, like using like those kinds of words, but like I knew something significant had happened. And essentially what it was is I could no longer manage the amount of pain that was going on in my life or whatever. And I was in college, and suddenly I remember very cognitively that like I couldn't remember anything about my life from like past the age of about like 15, like only minor details. Like I kind of like it was like I lost all my memories. And being someone who really valued my mind and my memory, suddenly I was in this really this sort of odd position of feeling like a kind of like a blank slated person. Like I knew who I was mostly, but I also it was like I lost the ability to remember all these key details about my life. And I remember the way I was rationalizing or telling myself a story about it at the time was, okay, this is your mind's way of healing because there's just some you're kind of like cognitively blocked. And the only way for you to get through this process is by shutting down. So around the time I was 20 years old, I just completely disconnected from anything that had to do with certain aspects of my past. I couldn't remember things my parents had done. I couldn't remember things that I associated with who I was as a person. I lost all my memories of like kind of like grade school and beyond. And it was like I had this blank slate. And at the time, it was really, really disconcerting, but it was also like I felt like I had this opportunity to suddenly kind of like reinvent myself in the things that I would do or that I wouldn't do. So as a result, like I was just like, oh, well, I'll just do anything. So, I decided to go, yeah, I lived in Oregon, in Portland at the time. So I would go to the mountain with my friends. I would take up snowboarding, and I would do this or I would do that. Things that I didn't necessarily associate with my personality because it was like, I just felt like a completely, almost like a blank slate of a person. And it wasn't until years later that I pieced together, like, oh, this is this really common thing. It's that eventually the psychic turmoil of your mind, it builds up and up and up and up. And when you're dealing with CPTSD and PTSD, that like in combination with one another, and then add bipolar to the mix, that like eventually you just shut down. And in that past year, I had gotten a DUI, like, drinking and driving, which, it's not good, obviously, like that wasn't a good thing for me to be doing, but in the context of everything else that was going on, that was pretty bad. I had enrolled in the Navy, um, and got kicked out of the delayed entry program, and my closest and best friend at that time, we all took mushrooms together that summer, and he he fell into like a deep psychosis and kind of stir all that together into a pot. And then by that December, I had moved out of my parents' narcissistic home environment. So it's just a lot in combination. And at the time, I was like, kind of like, beating myself up as those of us who are scapegoated narcissists by narcissistic systems tend to do. And I felt like, oh, I should just get through this. This is all kind of, my fault. And, just work through it and process things. But like, I wasn't really sure what to do. And fortunately, um, our university offered free student um, counseling, which was this really great thing that we had access to. And I went back to therapy for the first time since I was about like 13, 14, 15 years old. And at that time, I saw a number of therapists who were really, really, really ineffective. And fortunately for me, the student therapists that I saw, they were actually really great people. One woman in particular, she was blind and she had like this wonderful seeing eye dog. She was like extraordinarily insightful, and that's when I told her that I thought I was narcissistic. Funny enough, she's like, why do you suspect that? And, I told her why. She's like, it sounds like you grew up in an environment that had those sort of traits, but I don't really see you as narcissistic yourself, you know. But at that time, it was really hard to discern where my parents' personalities began and mine began because they were so intertwined and intermeshed. And just back to this idea of just collective memory, um, narcissists really they're constantly gaslighting you and changing their recollections, or challenging your recollections of the past and owning the narrative. I had a history teacher in high school who talked about Michael Parenti and just this idea of what we think of as history is this constant shifting, you know, concept. And that like who owns history? Who owns the narrative? It's kind of like this idea of the strongest reality, best reality. And if you live in a narcissistic household, more often than not, unless you are a really, really, really strong-willed person, the narcissist's recollection of events is often the like canonized sort of version of reality. And whether or not something actually happened, it doesn't matter. If the narcissist you know, if they believe it strongly enough, they will convince everyone in their army of flying monkeys and whoever else they need to establish a firm retelling or reevaluation of everything that happened, whether it was good or bad, even things that seem like banal or insignificant. The narcissist is always the one to put their stamp on what they believe transpired. Whether it was like, so for example, like odd things. Like with my dad, it was like I coached soccer for 3 years. And then 3 years became 4 years and like 5 years, whatever. And then, later in life, it was, when you moved to Vietnam at 26, you stole $10,000 from your mother and I, calling me drunk because my dad lost his job and you borrowed this significant amount of money and you need to pay that back right now. And I laughed. At that time, I was about 32, going on 33 years old, and was planning on moving to Japan with my partner at that time, and he had said, "You owe this to your mother and I. You stole $10,000." And he was obviously, like I mentioned, he was drunk, he was inebriated. It was like, I, I first of all, this is a work of fiction. Secondly, like, I'm moving to a new country. And this is like, because you're moving to a new country, you're not going to pay back the money that you stole from your mother and I. It's like, this idea of narcissistic injury giving way to this perceived slight that now needs to be squared away as an account, and all the favors I did for you and all that I've done for you and all the money that you've stolen from your mother and I, that you've embezzled from your mother and I. And I guess, this is a bit of a all over the place kind of thing, but there's this intersection between memory and liability and culpability, and as a scapegoat, you're subjected to all of this. And this idea that you had done this or you had done that, even you hadn't stolen $10,000. Your inner child, or at least for me, I can't speak for others, but it's just speaking for myself. You feel the guilt. There's a part of you that does question, like, did I do this? Did I take this money? And you really don't know until you piece together that this is the only way this person can thrive. That they need to believe all of these externalized stories and ridiculous, sort of like preposterous things about you as a way to mitigate their own feelings and their own guilt and their own story and their own narrative about the things that you've done as a person in order for them to be able to thrive or get their supply or whatever it is that they need. Get their crazy out, as my friend often says about his own mind that has BPD. Somewhat different, but the same in the scheme of like having to do this horrible thing as a way of dealing with these feelings that they can't suppress and having to channel that through an intermediary. It's like, it's never ending, and there's no low to which they won't stoop. And in the end, I'm sure anyone watching this, you're left to pick up the pieces. Now, in my case, my parents are still alive. I don't speak to them anymore. I've shut them out for the last and hopefully final time, and I'm sort of just waiting for them to pass on to their great reward, whatever that is. I've been gaslit. I've been pulled back in, like the famous Godfather line, once I get out, they pull me back in. So many times, too many times to count. And, I'm my family's favorite punching bag, immediate family. And, after the last straw, it was just like, the last straw for me was when I was in China. I was working as a teacher. My mom called me in a panic breath at 2, 3 in the morning. Of course, completely disregard the time. Um, and she and my father had been scammed out of, say like 15 or three, $3,000. And in her mind, she said that my credit card company had gotten commingled with their bank accounts, which is like, the height of like paranoid delusion. But in her mind, I was responsible for this, and I had created the situation where they had been scammed, and it was somehow my responsibility to rectify the situation. And when I told her that days before, I had had a major health problem, possible heart attack, she paused and then said, "Is that true?" And I said, "Yes. Um, I need to tell you this." And then she said, "Oh, the credit card company is calling. I have to go." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "Don't guilt trip me like I'm a horrible mother." Now, I had responded in a neutral tone of voice. I didn't say anything. I just said, "Okay." And it was like, "Oh, you're talking to me like I'm a horrible mother. Is that what you think of me?" I said, "I'm not saying anything." And then I unfriended her from social media, which had been a thing that happened in the past, the cat moon, and we never spoke again, after that, that was the last time that we chatted. And, good riddance, like goodbye, eventually, as I'm sure any one of you that's listening to this will know, you only have so many things that the people in your life who are narcissists, whether it's your partners or your parents, can do before it's like they've crossed every ultimatum, every boundary that they could ever be given. And it's just ultimately it's up to you whether what you're willing to accept, what you won't accept. And like at this point, they had been given so many chances and free passes. I kind of looked at myself in the mirror. I'm going gray. Like it's not even a question of like I'm a later adult now. I'm in my midlife. I had dedicated so much of my life to these people and their stories and their narratives, and at a certain point it's just like you don't even care about my life. You don't even value my life as a person. And that's when you know. I mean, you always know. You've known for years. I finally pieced it together. I gave it a name and a story and accounting. And when I was 33, but then it's like you you question yourself and you double check and you're like, wait, maybe I can fix it. And there's this part of you that wants to write a better story, and then ultimately, in your lowest of the low, they come at you, and finally, it was I had a major health scare, and I get an email from my father. He was like, maybe you should just never come up here ever again, even though it was my mother who had called me. I'm sure you guys know this. It's like they basically narcissists as they get older, they just get so sloppy. Like it's like and like before where they had crafted really like thrilling stories and subtle twists. Eventually, they get so sloppy. It's like you don't even have time for the nonsense anymore. Anyway, I don't know if I'm gonna post this. As always, I say this, but I just wanted to make a video. I don't know if any of this resonates with anyone. Hopefully it does. Saying goodbye, signing off from Vietnam. Hopefully I'll update this channel more often. And yeah, hopefully this is of use to some of you. All right, bye bye.